Hello viewers, welcome back. We've reached the end of Iron-Blooded Orphans, and I've gotta be honest, I feel like my mind is overflowing. I'm emotionally drained, the analytical side of my brain just feels tired and a little frustrated, and this season turned into one of those shows that I found myself comparing to a lot of other anime, which I try not to do too much. But you can definitely prepare for some of that here, and also spoilers, as I reflect back on how this series wrapped up. This is a really hard show to step back in time for now that I've seen the ending, but some time has passed since Tekkadan's success in getting Kudelia to Earth. At least a year, I'm thinking, though I don't remember being given an exact measure. In any case, our heroes have returned to Mars, and things have been going really well for them. Tekkadan is now recognized as a properly official, generally respectable company. Their affiliation with Teiwaz is going strong too, so they've got funding and new recruits and are on track for the better future Orga dreams of for them. Meanwhile, Kudelia's been making progress of her own. She's started a company in memory of Fumitan, and they've opened an orphanage and elementary school. And of course she's still working with the Earth leaders to make Mars more independent, slowly but surely shifting the power in the mining business so that the people doing the work will actually benefit from it. The world has changed a lot since we first met these characters, but it hasn't all been for the better. Trust in Gjallarhorn has fallen, and though they were corrupt and had it out for our heroes in particular, it's not like they'd completely forsaken their peacekeeping duties. Now that they've been revealed to be kind of shady, and been challenged and basically defeated, people are less intimidated by the threat of the Gjallarhorn name, and life along the trade routes and in general has become a lot more dangerous. Additionally, Tekkadan's success has really glorified the use of child soldiers, so the sale, capture, and exploitation of orphans like themselves has become even more common. That was an interesting little detail that I never would have considered, but it does make a lot of sense. Thankfully, we only really get to know 3 of the new recruits. The cast was already huge, and there are a bunch of new Gjallarhorn characters this season. But I love seeing the change this new dynamic brought about in all the old faces we got to know last season. They all seem so grown up and responsible, and it made me feel kinda warm and fuzzy inside, seeing them train the new guys. And while it never amounts to the problem I was expecting it to be, it was really interesting to see the different perspectives in the group now. All the new recruits are volunteers, whereas even the old members who weren't literally sold to the owners of the original company were there out of pretty desperate circumstances. Because they had nowhere else to go, or they had younger siblings to support, or that sort of thing. Even the new recruits who've come looking for battle glory come across as a little naive, but they grow to be just as loyal, and just as taken in by Orga's speeches about them being a family, so it never turns into the conflict I was waiting for. Which is one thing Tekkadan's got going for them at least, because Season 2's got no shortage of conflicts. To correct a misconception I had at the end of the last season, McGillis isn't the big boss of Gjallarhorn. Yet, that is still his plan. He's taken over as the head of Earth's main fleet and hasn't given our heroes any trouble since. But he contacts Orga after one of Tekkadan's mines is attacked by the first big villain of Season 2, a group of pirates who've grown powerful enough to even cause problems for Gjallarhorn and Teiwaz. McGillis wants to hire Tekkadan to take them out, offering backup at least, as they'd be horribly outnumbered. Orga agrees. After the showdown at the mine, the pirates won't rest until they're destroyed, so it would have been a necessary battle anyway this time. But this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to collaborating with McGillis, an unsettling hint of what's to come. McGillis being more in line with our heroes than our antagonists is something I'll pick apart later. In any case, this switch made room for the actual main villain. Rustal Elion leads the Arianrod fleet, which is basically recognized as the most elite Gjallarhorn unit. Working directly under him are Julieta, who practically worships him and is one of those characters who's living solely for the purpose of being a weapon for someone else, and Eok, the young head to one of Gallarhorn's 7 Stars families, who's passionate and charismatic, but reckless and naive, too. And it's not all Gallarhorn this time around. On the Tewa's side of things, Jasly Donamikels, the big boss's second-in-command, is looking to take over as soon as possible, to take what he feels rightly belongs to him, but he feels threatened by the influence Naze and Tekkadan have and isn't above supplying their enemies with information. And these are just the main 4. There's really no shortage of people looking to take them down this season. With the decline of trust in Gallarhorn, independent defense forces have been popping up in the various Earth regions. A group from Tekkadan was left behind to train and advise the region in charge of Mars. After an attack on the Prime Minister, who's also been Kudelia's main supporter, the region's defense forces quickly spiral into a war set up by Rustal to undermine McGillis. Tekkadan backup arrives from Mars at about the same time McGillis joins the battle himself. They put a stop to it pretty easily. Rustal cuts off contact with the people he'd been manipulating into starting this conflict, and Prime Minister Makanai makes a full recovery, but this makes the suspicions of an alliance between Tekkadan and McGillis a little more public. As it's basically official now, McGillis finally reveals his bigger plan to Orga. He wants to rule over all of Gallarhorn, and he promises to hand over the entire Mars branch to Tekkadan if they help him accomplish this. Orga is pretty sucked in by this idea of becoming the sovereign of Mars. Not by the lure of personal power, I should add. His end goal always was and still is the best possible life for the family he's created through Tekkadan. I never had any doubts about that. But Orga's character grew to be a little uncomfortable for me during these 25 episodes. I complained in my last review that he seemed just a little too good at his role as leader already. It was during this season I started to see his youth and personal shortcomings. Orga is just a little too used to being the underdog with nothing to lose, I felt. Naze brings it up when he has to smooth things over with the Tewa's leaders for the umpteenth time, but Orga has almost no diplomatic skills to speak of. It's not even that he comes across as overly arrogant or anything. He doesn't seem to have any trouble being humble around the people he respects. He's just got a very all-or-nothing mindset still, rushing into decisions he knows are risky, like they're still backed up against a wall. And the thing is, they do have options now. It just became pretty clear that he couldn't get out of this mindset brought on by having nothing. It's all he knows, and it started to feel like nothing was ever going to be good enough. Honestly, I usually try to get the story across, more or less chronologically, but I'm gonna start skipping around a bit. Season 2 was a little rougher, faster paced than the first season, but it doesn't come together quite as cleanly for me. Instead of one big goal that they were constantly striving for, getting Kudelia to Earth so she could put into motion this vague, better future they were aiming for, Season 2 is made up of a lot of loosely woven together, smaller conflicts that just push them one step closer to destruction. And I guess that's the real spoiler here. They try valiantly to smooth it over at the end, but Iron-Blooded Orphans doesn't really have a happy ending. Not in my eyes, anyway. The thing that really leaves a bitter taste in my mouth is watching them slowly be led to their downfall by someone Orga knew he couldn't trust in the first place, because buying into McGillis's plans are what really screws them over in the end, and not even because he purposely double-crosses them this time, but because this is one of McGillis's specialties. No one can tell that there's something not quite right about him until it's typically too late. And I'm not sure I even mean that in a he's got a few screws loose mentally sort of way. I mentioned in my review for Season 1 that it felt a little strange to see McGillis set up to be able to relate to the kids in Tekkadan when that's something we never saw from Ein, who felt like he would have been better suited to that storyline. But we get a more complete look at what McGillis's life was like before he was adopted by the head of the Farid family. And after. Let's just say it was rife with the kind of abuse that no one likes to talk about, and it really explained a few things for me. His obsession with power, for one, and his need to be the one in power, to free the world from the people who'd abuse it. But also there was something a little childlike about him. We see him as a kid constantly lugging around this big book about the founder of Gallarhorn, who he's really come to idolize in a hero worship sort of way, and who he's basically looking to revive through his own actions. But it really wasn't that he ever came across as unhinged or naive. It really feels like a part of him was just unable to grow up. Like tempering these grand dreams would make what he'd gone through to get to this point just a little too hard to bear, was the overall vibe I got from his character at the end, when it had become clear to everyone else that it was a losing battle. What really caught me off guard, though, was how much the latter half of McGillis's story endeared me to Gaelio, who was barely worth mentioning last season. He was the other inspector McGillis was working with, and who we find out this season he didn't quite succeed in killing. And that actually disappointed me when it was first revealed, because Iron-Blooded Orphans really didn't need another obsessive revenge plotline. But McGillis's death scene was actually one of my favorite things in this whole show. Gaelio was naive, and a bit sheltered, and very much a product of his environment. He was really disgusted seeing the members of Tekkadan use the Alea Vignana system, as that sort of body modification was really demonized after the Calamity War. But already his views were challenged a little in Season 1 when he learns that it was actually developed by Gallarhorn, and then further when it was the only way to, sort of, keep Ayn alive, who he'd grown close to and whose death he felt responsible for. And then he gets a great moment this season where he reflects back on how much he admired McGillis and how proud he was just to get to stand by his side and call him his best friend. They both get great moments during this scene, with McGillis telling him how hard it was at times to harden himself against that friendship and the happier life that was already at his fingertips to follow his bigger ambitions. And Gaelio responds, telling him to just stop talking, because he won't be able to stop himself from forgiving McGillis if he shows even that little bit of remorse. Gaelio really was a kind soul at heart, and one of the best characters in the whole show, though that wasn't something I could appreciate until the very end. And that might be because the focus this season was very Gallarhorn heavy, and I wasn't crazy about that most of the time. It reached a point where I was just getting increasingly salty about the Gallarhorn characters taking so much screen time from the characters I really cared about, but that last scene between Gaelio and McGillis moved me a lot more than I'd expected it to. I'd become kind of numb to the deaths by that point, because there are a lot of them. Honestly, most of the characters who die, though perfectly likable, wouldn't have been important enough to the story to even mention otherwise. Except now it's made me want to talk about the deaths in a writing sense. Biscuit's death, near the end of the last season, was the first one to truly shake me. This is the type of show where plot armor isn't really a thing, and that's actually a plus for me. I like being kept on my toes like that. It helps make the danger feel real, and that can be really interesting from a writer's perspective too. Killing off characters can really affect the dynamic of a group. Biscuit, for instance, had a grounding effect on Orga and made him think through his decisions a bit more. I found myself thinking a lot this season that things might have been very different for Tekkadan if Biscuit had lived. I see this review quickly moving in the direction of the story only being worth talking about in regards to how well the character deaths in that particular arc came across, and yeah, I said it before, the story in this season felt a little sloppy. It was characters I continued to love that saved this one for me, even if I did have to watch most of them die one by one. For me, a good death in a story is one that flows well with whatever's going on with the plot. It doesn't always have to be the most dramatic or the most satisfying. Shino, for example, went out with a bang but failed to accomplish what that last attack was meant to, which just felt like a harsh reality of a battle that already wasn't going their way. it didn't take away from the emotional impact of losing him. I have a problem with the writers being a little trigger-happy when it starts to feel manipulative. Aston's death felt too manipulative to really care about. It takes place during that short war on Earth, which was just a mess in general. I know it was intentional that the characters didn't even really know what they were fighting for, but that made it hard to care about as a viewer. I could see it being set up from the very beginning, but it just felt so unnecessary. The product of one last reckless attack after the fighting had come to a halt and the deception was about to be revealed. I just haven't been able to come up with any good reason that they had to kill off this kid in particular. Like, it could be argued that this is the event that makes Takaki decide to quit Tekiden, but though he does go to work for the Prime Minister, he doesn't do anything of real significance for the story after this, so yeah. It kinda just feels like the writers are playing with us, just proving that they can cause us heartbreak if they want to, and I hate that. But that didn't annoy me half as much as Lofter's death, precisely because hers wasn't drawn out at all, ironically. I know this section, full of characters that I never brought up before, may really only resonate with people who've already seen the show, but just understand that Lofter was one of the best pilots in the series. She was holding her own against Mikazuki back in Season 1, and when the girls from Naze's ship stay on with Tekiden, it's specifically to train the boys to be better fighters. This is not a show that's had a problem with respecting its female characters. One of the most off-putting Jasly scenes, as if we needed another reason not to like him, is one where he mocks Naze for employing women and throwing them out onto the front lines of battle, not understanding that not only are they perfectly capable, but that all the Turban girls are exactly where they want to be. What I'm trying to say is that Lofter deserved a warrior's death, not to be shot down by a bunch of nameless, faceless henchmen trying to provoke Tekiden into a fight. I didn't have the same reaction to Orga's death, though I kinda felt like I should at first, as he's one of the most important characters, and he dies in pretty much the same way. I'd started to suspect we were going to lose Orga. He was just on that path to self-destruction, but I did get a sense of closure from Orga's death. By this point in the story, McGillis has unearthed the legendary Gundam used by the creator of Gallarhorn. According to the ancient rules, this should grant him authority over the whole organization. Unfortunately, this was his whole plan, so when Rustal Elion reveals his crimes to get to this point, and that he's adopted, and thus not a true heir to the legacy, the rest of Gallarhorn turns on him, and our heroes have got no hope of victory. Orga does at least succeed in finalizing a plan for the members of Tekiden, which will have to disband, to escape to Earth under new identities. It was also kind of empowering to watch the remaining members of Tekiden rally and continue to work together after their leader was gone. Things had gone so downhill already, watching them completely go to pieces would have been just a little too much. This really has turned into more character discussion than review. I'll touch on that a little when I talk about the series overall, but this wouldn't be complete without talking about one more character. Speaking of characters whose growth was uncomfortable, it's about time we talk about Mika. His conflicts with Giulietta were particularly interesting this season because they definitely have their similarities. Mika also sees himself as a weapon, but that was always softened out a bit by his relationships with others. He would do anything Orga asked of him, but he was just as passionate about reaching that end goal, that better place where they could all be happy. But he tells Kudelia that he doesn't feel like there'd be a place for him in the world she's trying to create, a world without fighting. I've mentioned before that the Alea Vignana system isn't exactly the safest thing, and if Orga's slowly destroying himself emotionally, Mika's doing it physically. As the battles get more intense and he pushes himself further and further, letting his Gundam access his brain past what the safety blocks would usually allow, it wreaks havoc on his body. By the end, he's blind in one eye and has lost all control of his right side, except when he's hooked up to Barbatos, only furthering this belief that fighting is all he's good for, and in turn convincing himself to take more risks, because even if he sustains more injuries, he'll be fine once he's hooked up to his Gundam. He isn't at all bothered by this. His outlook might be uplifting under other circumstances, but it was just kind of depressing to watch. I think it's the second opening where there's this shot of Orga picking Mika up that just sums it up completely. As he hoists Mika over his shoulder, all the camera lets us see is the half of his body he can't use and the eye that doesn't work anymore. He already looks dead. It is suitably disturbing. But he really does make the most of his disabilities. It was his mindset more than anything else that clued me into Mikazuki most likely not making it out of this series alive either. He at least makes it to the end. He's one of the ones who stays behind to distract the Gallarhorn troops so the others can escape. It was a satisfyingly honorable death, and after a series that tried its best to break my heart, it was one of the few scenes that did make me tear up. Giulietta questions why he continues to fight a hopeless battle, and he has this little monologue, not really answering her so much as just thinking to himself, and he talks about how his life used to have no meaning, and now he has so many people he cares about and wants to create that better life Orga dreamed of for them, to make it to that better place. And he kinda just stops at the end and realizes, oh, I see now that we were already there. And that realization, when it is far too late, is just fucking tragic. It's gonna make me cry again just reflecting on it, so let's move on. At the end of it all, Iron-Blooded Orphans is not a happy show. And the thing is, an ending doesn't necessarily have to be happy to be good. I've argued since I first saw it that Old Noah Zero would have been a better show, overall, if it had ended with Season 1, even though that would have been another tragedy like this one that killed off most of its main characters. But it would have fit with that series, where it really didn't with this one. Make no mistake, Season 1 could be dark, but it also had such a feel-good vibe to it overall. It was an underdog rebellion story, watching a bunch of kids rise up against the society that abused them. It was empowering. And if you're looking for that happier ending, where you most likely didn't watch your favorite character meet some gruesome end, I think Season 1 really could stand alone. The big mission of that arc is completed, and Mika and Orga have this really nice little moment near the end in the aftermath of the battle, where he asks if this is the better place they've been dreaming of, and Orga tells him that, yeah, it's one of them, which could be seen as wrapping up that aspect of the story. Season 1 just ends in a very good place, where even if all the problems aren't solved yet, there's every reason to believe they will be. Season 2's epilogue technically leaves us off with a reformed world where everyone who's left is happy and moving forward. But at what cost? It was almost exactly the feeling I had at the end of Another, which is framed like this happy, triumphant thing. I just couldn't get into it when, practically everyone was dead. There were just a few times when I was watching this season, especially the further in I got, where it was just like, who wanted this? Who gets into this type of empowering story and then goes, you know what I'd like to see in Season 2? Everything go wrong, most of these characters die, and the company that finally gave them a sense of family be destroyed. It just feels like it doesn't fit to me. That said, I don't actually hate Season 2. The story's a little all over the place, but it does still feel true to the characters who made it great, and even does justice to most of the ones it kills off. It even endeared me to some I really wasn't attached to in the first half. I don't feel compelled to convince myself the whole second season didn't happen, so that's something. Thank you one final time, Ninjammer726, for requesting this anime to me. It's definitely one that's going to stay with me. I've actually already started rewatching it to see what the experience is like the second time around. I have to admit, I'm a little relieved to have reached the end of these requests for now. As much as I do have a list of things I plan to get to someday, there is a fun to be found in jumping into things on a whim. I think I'll aim for something light and happy after this. Thank you for watching.